Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am Reverend Hector J. Hernandez, and I serve as the Director of Community Engagement for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of the United States and Canada. Today's webinar, Restorative Justice in Action, concludes our 2022 series of webinars and educational training offered by the Prison and Jail Ministries of the National Benevolent Association. And as we get started, I would like to inform you all that this webinar, like all our webinars, will be recorded and available for future viewing at the NBA website, nbacares.org. If you have questions through the webinar, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen and to submit your questions. But please include your email address in case we are unable to get through your question. We could follow up with you directly via email after the webinar is over. Today's webinar continues the National Benevolent Association promotion of the biblically based principle of restorative justice. And it will feature a conversation, a reflection between an amazing group of people who have participated in restorative justice conferences and who's going to be sharing their own experiences with their practices. And at this time, I would like to briefly introduce each of these speakers. We have with us Jonathan Shar, who is the director of the Restorative Justice Project at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And he has extensive experience as a facilitator of restorative justice dialogues in sensitive and violent crimes, and as a trainer in a variety of restorative justice practices. Welcome, Jonathan. We have also here with us Craig Susek, who at 16 years old shot and seriously injured a woman, landing him in prison for 25 years. In 1997, he had the opportunity to meet the person he harmed, and it changed his life forever. Now, 43, he is a returning citizen who advocates for restorative justice practices because he experienced firsthand how life-altering they can be. Welcome, Craig. We also have with us today Reverend Nora Jacobs. I'm a big fan of her, who is an ordained minister in the Disciples of Christ Church, who serves as on the staff of the Covina Community Church, and who is a minister of reconciliation and coordinator of prison outreach. She has been a restorative justice practitioner, trainer, and educator since 2014. And right now, she currently works as a restorative justice and care supervisor for the nonprofit Just Us for Youth. Bienvenida. Welcome, Nora. And finally, we have Angel Wendt. He's an elementary teacher passionate about social responsibility and emotional growth. Her passion focuses not only on educating the youth, but also on those who need a second chance. She has spent a substantial part of the last 10 years working with individuals in different capacities to spread awareness of their decisions' impact on others. Bienvenida and welcome all of you. It is more than a privilege having all of you here today in this space. And at this time, I would like to turn this webinar to our Reverend Dean Bucalos, who is the mission specialist of the Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group of the MBA. Dean, take the lead.
Thank you, Hector, and good evening. We're so glad that those who've tuned in and joined us for this important webinar. I think you're really going to be enlightened by the stories that you hear this evening. We're going to begin our webinar with a short description of the principles of restorative justice and how it's designed to operate. This is an area that the National Benevolent Association has been promoting in a number of webinars over the last couple of years, because we believe this is an important movement and an alternative to the retributive justice approach to criminal justice in our country these days, which obviously, if anybody has been paying attention, has not been working very well. The restorative justice movement is an alternative that we believe not only is strongly biblically based, but also is transformative in the ways that it meets people's needs, both people who have caused harm as well as people who've been harmed, as well as our communities. We're delighted this evening to have Reverend Nora Jacob, who has vast experience in leading restorative justice circles, who will provide us with a brief overview as we learn more about the ways it has impacted the lives not only of our panelists, but so many other people across the country and across the years. So I'm going to turn it over to Nora.
Thank you so much, Dean. Good evening, everybody. For most people in the United States, restorative justice is a really different approach to justice than the current criminal justice system. The current justice system here focuses on punishment, but restorative justice is an alternative approach that focuses on repairing harm and restoring relationships instead of punishing people and then allowing that brokenness to continue, thereby causing more harm. The punitive justice approach asks questions like, what rule was broken and what punishment needs to be delivered? There are offenders or perpetrators, and there are victims or survivors. But the reality of the ripple effect of harm and of healing is ignored. In place of assigning blame and punishment, instead focusing for retributive justice, criminal justice, it mostly focuses on what to do in the way of retribution to the person who did harm. Restorative justice is very different. Restorative justice asks questions like who or what was harmed and what needs to be done to repair that harm. How might everyone involved find healing? How might relationships be restored? It prioritizes those who are harmed, the people who are often called victims or survivors, and it recognizes three very powerful and interconnected truths. First, hurt people hurt people. And all of us are hurt people at some level. It also recognizes that healing people or healed people heal people. And so we keep that in mind instead of the criminal punitive approach. A note about the context of restorative justice in relationship to criminal justice. Criminal justice is a colonial import of the Anglo-European legal system. Restorative justice is rooted in the traditions of many indigenous peoples around the world, and it can be found in action in different ways throughout the world. Restorative justice has had a resurgence in the United States since some of the peace movements in the mid-1970s. Today, activists, People of faith promote restorative justice as a way to reform the United States' current justice system. And today, the discipline of restorative practices is actually an academic area of study in colleges and universities around the world. Research has demonstrated that restorative approaches reduce recidivism rates significantly. That is, how much people go back to prison after they've been exposed to and practicing restorative justice. And the restorative approaches also produce greater satisfaction for all parties involved in incidents of harm, not just those directly involved, as we have tonight with Craig and Angel, but also those who are stakeholders, who may be family members, friends, teachers, others who are affected, people who read the newspaper about some of this harm. A woman named Beverly Title created a way to give a framework for the principles of restorative justice. She used what she called the 5 R's, and they go in order, but they're also they move around. Relationship, respect, responsibility, which is also accountability, repair, and reconciliation. These are all vital, right, to understanding ourselves as humans in an interconnected web of people, actions, and all of creation. And these are at the core of the biblical principles that restorative justice reflects. Relationship, the first principle, is what Jesus was all about. Jesus was really all about relationship from one dimension, that you look at him and his life. But when you think about it, relationships with Jesus were always pointed toward reintegration, reconciliation, reintegration with self, with community, and with God. There are individual and societal stories in the Bible that demonstrate RJ principles. Perhaps the most impactful in terms of the societal change that restorative justice can bring is the story of an individual conversion, if you will, the story of Zacchaeus in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19. Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector in Jericho, and thus someone who's sort of the IRS of his time, and certainly a kind of traitor to his own Jewish people, climbs up a sycamore tree to see Jesus, if you remember the story. Jesus notices him, invites him down, asks him to go to dinner at Zacchaeus's home. Relationship. At the end of which Zacchaeus offers, as the scripture says, half of his goods to the poor, and if he has anything else from any man by false accusation, he, Zacchaeus, will restore that person's wealth fourfold. That's a powerful story of restorative justice. Here's another one that's a little more intricate, and one that I think has powerful impact for us today. It's in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, where we meet a man in Bethsaida who couldn't see, whose friend takes him to Jesus for healing. It takes 2 tries, during which the blind man, after the first try, says he can see people, but they looked like trees walking around. The second time, though, the healing works, and Jesus sends the man off. And this is what Jesus says: don't go back into the village on your way home. People who had infirmities, who had disabilities, maybe in today's context, people with addictions, people who are broken for whatever reason and outcast and pushed to the margin. Healed, don't go back to the village on your way home. Go someplace healthier. But where then should this man go? Today, with 2,000 plus years of Christian faith and churches in place, I would hope that any faith community would welcome that man into community. That's the start of restorative justice. So part of what I love about this work is just being able to say to all of you, is that how we're all behaving? I hope it is. I hope that what you'll hear tonight will give you some inspiration to welcome in people who may have struggled with their past, and yet who have found not just relationship, but mutual respect, that sense of accountability or responsibility, going on to repair and reconciliation. Tonight, you're going to hear a story about one of the kinds of restorative practices that we carry out. It's a victim-offender dialogue that was facilitated by someone highly trained in this work. It's one of the things we do. We also do listening circles. We also do mediations. We do group and family work. These practices have grown to reach all kinds of people in all kinds of settings. My joy in tonight is that you will be listening to, and Craig and Angel and Jonathan will be graciously sharing something that very few of us get to hear about. And for that, deep respect. Thank you for giving us that look at relationship being healed and reconciled. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. We're hoping that this webinar will be one that encourages you to learn more about restorative justice. There are a lot of resources that are out, not only on the National Benevolent Association website, but in various other places. Or you can contact any one of us and we'll direct you to resources if you would like to learn more about it. And restorative justice movement is really one that is dependent on individuals, not necessarily specialists, but people who are trained to be facilitators in their communities, who are willing to step into a new way of problem solving. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about restorative justice is that we are steeped in a correction system that's broken, and rather than continuing to do the same thing over and over and hoping for different results and outcomes, what we're hoping to introduce is a different approach, a different way of doing things, a different way of thinking about things, a different way of living into community that will result in different outcomes, better outcomes, not only for people who have been harmed, but also for those people who have harmed someone else. It's healthy for our community and it's healthy for each individual. So we've been delighted to be able to gather together this panel of folks who have had experience with restorative justice. We sent them some questions for them to consider. And I'm going to begin by asking the first question, and I'll start with Jonathan. How were you introduced to restorative justice? And why did you agree to participate?
All right. Well, thank you for having us. Definitely appreciate being able to talk about restorative justice and share a bit of our experiences with everyone. So my introduction to restorative justice came in the fall of 2005. It was really during my first semester of law school. I had the great fortune of being exposed to this actual very process. So at the time, sort of, victim offender dialogue process by Dr. Mark Umbright and Justice Janine Geske at Marquette University Law School, where they were presenting or talking about this very topic, talking about restorative justice. And it immediately resonated with me quite deeply in the sense of thinking about systems, thinking about sort of our criminal legal system, thinking about the role of lawyers, and then sort of seeing what was possible and hearing people, again, quite honestly, sort of just like we're going to hear tonight. That was sort of my introduction to it, was hearing from people who experienced this process and people who facilitated this process, and talking about the profound transformation and healing that is possible through it, that immediately connected deeply with me, and felt like this is something that I want to be a part of, and frankly need to be a part of. When I came to law school, I didn't necessarily want to wait 3 years to help people, and so this was a way that I saw immediately that this was like, I got to get involved in this. So again, thinking about this idea of what the implication is for sort of our broader legal systems. You mentioned this idea of our talk about our carceral system or criminal legal system is sort of being broken, and really we need to think about it in the way that like systems operate the way that they're designed. Okay. And so when we don't like our outputs or our outcomes, well, quite frankly, the design gives us the outcomes that we see. So that sense that we need to think about things a little bit differently and doing things differently if we want to get different results. And so I was definitely taken by the concept of restorative justice, which was about human connection, as a really stark contrast to our systems that artificially separate people. As soon as a case enters the legal system of, no contact orders, and again about sort of sifting through what has happened, but instead looking at restorative justice in the space of how to utilize law as a healing tool. And I sort of knew that this was something that was going to be part of my life. I didn't necessarily know exactly what that would be, but being able to see the profound effect this has had on people's lives really drew me to that, and I've really never looked back. Since that point, it's been a part of my life and practice and my world, really since getting involved in the sort of spring of 2006 and summer of 2006, and has continued into my current role, where I've been with the law school and with this restorative justice project for about 10 years now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Craig, I'm going to ask you to share your story, a fascinating story of redemption and reconciliation. So how were you introduced to restorative justice, and why did you agree to participate?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone for listening, and hopefully we can all get something beneficial from each other. I was introduced to restorative justice roughly 1996. I was 17 years old at the time in Green Bay Correctional Institution, which is a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. I was extremely guilt-ridden for my actions, for my crime, for hurting specifically one person, but from that, many other people, family members of hers, of mine, friends, people in the community. I was obviously young, but I still had a good enough understanding that what I had done hurt a lot of people, and I was sorry for that. So in the process of speaking to my appeals attorney, she picked up on that was my driving force of not necessarily caring about appeals or anything. I just wanted to say that I was sorry. And as Jonathan alluded to, the so-called justice system isn't about allowing a person to say, I am sorry to a victim or victims. There's a separation there. And all I wanted to say was I was sorry. I didn't know if that would be enough. But that's my one desire, was to say that. So through that, my appeals attorney introduced me to Bruce Kittle. He was at that time the head of the restorative justice, and we started talking. And I liked what I heard. Ultimately, it was a vehicle to allow me to apologize. And that's why I agreed to participate in the program, was hopefully to, in some small way, relieve some burden from the direct victim of mine. And that was the ultimate goal. And then from there, over the course of 20 some years, it continued to just grow. But that's why I agreed.
Thank you, Craig. Angel, you've come to restorative justice from a very different angle. So how were you introduced to restorative justice, and why did you agree to participate?
Thank you. I came to restorative justice because in 2010, my brother was killed in a drunk driving incident. We were absolutely shaken. Our community was absolutely shaken. And I found that in that time, my driving force was absolutely in line with what I would say common culture expected it to be. I attended all of the hearings. I participated in as much as was absolutely possible. And because my mindset at that point was that um, it was my job. I would find healing through um, making sure that the man who had done this got all that he had coming for him. After sentencing, the DA actually that we were working with, she brought us right into her office, myself and our family members that were attending that sentencing hearing. And her goal in that meeting was to discuss what our rights as victims were. Um, there were several things that she went over, pamphlets that she handed out. But the one that caught our attention the most was the possibility to participate in restorative justice. I had never heard of anything like that, but my father actually was the one who had jumped in 2 feet straight out the gate. He was very interested in this idea of a restorative conference or victim offender dialogue. And right there started the process to participate in this dialogue with the man who had just been sentenced for killing my brother. I was not interested at all at that point. I was very cold. I was very angry. I was incredibly bitter. And I couldn't see outside my own bubble. Um, as the um, as the next year kind of went on, I started to see more and more how my attitude, my approach to life, my very limited coping skills were impacting those around me, primarily my children and my marriage. I teach, and I can honestly say that it was even spilling right into my classroom. At that point, I decided that something needed to change, and maybe there was a spot in this restorative justice program for me. So I actually started speaking on a victims impact panel in our community. And I thought that this was going to bring that ever sought after closure, bring some light possibly into my very dark world. And it did a little. Um, but what I started to see was that these panels, even though I stood up there and I talked to all of these people about what had happened, and I tried to educate and bring light to the gravity of one's decisions and how they really truly do impact in a huge ripple out from your one tiny choice. And I spent so much time pouring into that, never realizing that I myself in the process was being changed also. And one particular panel, I actually had an attendee come up and introduce himself. And he thanked me for sharing my side of the story because he had been a man that was drinking with a man who killed my brother. And he knew that side of the story, and I was blindsided because never, ever in all of my time standing up on that stage had I ever even considered that there was another side to this story, that I wasn't the only one, that my family wasn't the only one that had a story to tell. And that moment right there was a life-changing, absolutely life-changing moment And that's when I decided that it was time to go ahead and start the process of doing my own victim offender dialogue.
Thank you, Angel. So we've brought together these three folks because they have engaged in restorative justice in very different ways. I'm going to go back to Jonathan. I'm curious and fascinated by your involvement with restorative justice, primarily as an attorney, Jonathan. I mean, so I practiced law for a number of years before going into the ministry. I know that in the practice of law, the training is one to be a part of an adversarial system. And yet restorative justice is so different than that. Can you share with us a little bit about your experience as a facilitator?
Yeah, gladly. We're always shaped by sort of the people around us, the people that come into our lives. And I would say I had the great fortune to have an incredible mentor, in Janine Geske, who literally left the Wisconsin Supreme Court to pursue and promote restorative justice. And so that sense of, while classically trained in this space of an adversarial system, the most directly influential individual also was someone who resonates with wanting deep human connection and how we can legally represent people in a way that encompasses their whole person, their being, who they are, their past, their present, and their future, and that thinks about them holistically. And so, this idea of, especially that space and the lens or frame that I have, thinking about, this idea that, nothing in our criminal legal system really encourages accountability. It's really all about minimization, deflection, diffusion of responsibility, because the more you admit, the more that you're punished or harmed. It's a space where it's really hard to hear one another. It's quite impersonal, because it is, again, sort of all about whether it's the rules of criminal procedure or the rules of civil procedure, the rules of evidence. But it's really not designed in a way for people to hear one another. And it's not really designed to be responsive or sensitive to individuals who've experienced harm, whether that's in the criminal system or even the civil system. That we have very limited responses, and a very narrow view of what either justice is or what we can give people or what we can do for people. And so getting to operate in this space, in the restorative justice space, and specifically as a facilitator, I view as incredibly fortunate to have that opportunity. I mean, it is a deep privilege to be able to be invited into the darkest spaces of people's lives, to walk with them, to seek healing with them, to seek justice and to seek knowledge with them, to seek understanding and human connection, and again, really bring about something good in the aftermath of something horrific and horrible. I think about my role often as like I'm there sort of cleaning up the mess or cleaning up the pieces of the legal system that sort of leaves in the wake, where again, it divides and separates people and leaves people with a ton of questions. Even our sort of trial system, again, is often not very satisfying to many people, victims especially, who don't necessarily get the information or answers that they need. The sense of the rules of evidence sets what's relevant, but what's relevant to proving a given issue is only a speck of what is relevant to the individuals who've been hurt. And the harm and pain that they have experienced. And similarly, what is relevant about a person who's been responsible for harm is merely a fraction, a glimpse, or a snapshot in time of who this person is, how they got there. And so getting to exist in this sort of space as a facilitator is about bringing all of those things together to create a shared narrative about what happened, about what people have experienced, and about, almost as most importantly, where do we go from here, right? So being very future oriented. So that space, I view it as an incredible honor, right? To exist in this sort of world of restorative justice, and to again have the privilege of facilitating and really just being a process guide, for individuals to help them find whatever it is that they're looking for that they haven't been able to find in the legal system.
Thank you, Jonathan. So my understanding is, as a facilitator, you bring these people together at a conference, and they share their stories. They move toward a resolution of a way to repair the harm. For those who are listening, just briefly, well, what does it take to become a facilitator? What kind of training is involved?
Um, Part of that is really going to depend on what it is that you're doing. So what is the process that you're utilizing? What is the area that you're sort of working in? So the space that you'll hear from tonight is really, again, it's sort of this serious and sensitive harm world where we work with, again, a lot of homicides or sexual harm cases or crimes against children, or crimes of violence. And so that takes, I think, necessarily a bit more training and experience to deal with that. But generally, there you can be trained to be a circle keeper, right? Depending on the process, a circle process or a conferencing process, all with the same sort of fundamentals, right? The sense of again, how we explore situations, how we look at other individuals. That sense of what is necessary to become a facilitator, or what training. There's a bunch of different types of trainings that exist around the country. So there's many organizations that people could look to become either volunteer facilitators or working with youth. And so again, thinking about the broad umbrella that restorative justice sort of is, which encompasses a number of restorative practices and different processes. So I have a very sort of specific training program for the students that I teach that assist in sort of this work, that has an emphasis on sort of trauma and understanding a whole bunch about, crime dynamics and victimology and neurobiology and a whole sort of host of other related things when we're sort of diving into this work. But quite honestly, the other simple answer is almost anybody can do this, right? It's a sense of bringing your whole self, bringing your humanity, your personhood, your lived experience to this space that's just about sort of showing up, meeting people where they're at, recognizing and acknowledging their humanity, and holding space with them, right? So sitting in circle with them. And so in some ways, it's some of the simplest things in the world as well.
Thank you. That's helpful. Craig, we're going to turn to you. You gave us a little bit of a glimpse of how you got involved in restorative justice and why you agreed to participate. But can you share a little bit more about your experience as a person who harmed another person, and then a little bit of those circumstances that that you lived through?
Well, how about I start with circumstances that I lived through? Because the circumstances that I lived through led to me harming another. So Nora had said, I was a hurt person that was hurting, and I wound up hurting, again, not just one person. I wound up hurting a multitude of people, because I think, as any of us probably know, there's no truly just one victim in a victimization process. It's unfortunately, I shot one person, but hundreds or more people were affected by that action. I was raised in a home that was less than nurturing, by a single parent, in one way or another, that was less than loving. I was left to my own devices. Throughout the course of my youth, I was neglected emotionally, mentally, physically. I was beaten, molested by a family member. So all these added up to a child that was empty and lost and confused and very angry. I didn't, I wasn't aware that I was angry until years later. But these things led up to me harming someone. Eventually got to the point at age 16 where I stopped caring about anything or anyone. All I wanted to do was get away from the harm, the hurt that was instilled upon me from family members and, society at large. I viewed it at that point, I guess. So that led me to entering another person's home and shooting a complete stranger. Even today, going on 28 years later, it's still a difficult thing to accept that was me that did that. Because I don't feel that I'm that person any longer, obviously, but it's so far gone from that action to today that it's hard to comprehend. So I don't know. I think it's hard for me to answer my experience as a person that harmed someone, other than to say that I was extremely remorseful from the beginning of the action. I was very guilt ridden. It was hard to live life knowing that I did what I did. And in the beginning, before I had a restorative justice in that year, I didn't understand. I couldn't fathom how I would move forward in life. Like, what good is life going to be based off of my action, based off of the harm that I put into the world? So I was even more lost than the lost kid that committed this atrocity. And then along came restorative justice. So as a person that harmed someone, I was able to meet the lady that I harmed directly. And she forgave me for what I did immediately, without reservation, zero hesitation, and all in forgiving is what she gave to me. And that one action altered the course of my life. So it took me, I don't know, probably 15 years to be able to forgive myself for harming someone. But it was through the lady I shot. I don't know if I can say her name on here, so I won't. But she altered my life. Bruce Kittle altered my life. Jonathan Shar altered my life. It took me from a person that was defined by that action. Like, that's what I thought as a person that harmed something. I thought that because in one moment in time, I don't say that I made a mistake, because I think that's poor phrasing. I made a series of bad choices. I thought that defined me. And I was able to understand that that's not who I was by definition. I could make more choices every day, multiple times a day, moving forward to become a better person. So ultimately, my initial experience as a person that harmed someone was just very chaotic, confusing, and difficult. And it was made into be something more beautiful through the restorative justice process. I don't know if that answered what you're looking for, Dean, but if not, let me know, please.
No, thank you so much, Greg, for your willingness to share that important part of your life with us and how it's changed you. It's remarkable to see that, and I'm grateful for your willingness to be a part of this process. So thank you. We're going to turn to Angel now, who has had a different experience with the loss of her brother. So tell us a little bit about your experience as a person who was harmed, Angel, and a little bit of those circumstances. You shared some of that, but maybe you could give us a little bit more information about that.
Absolutely, thank you. So as I stated earlier, I, prior to really diving into restorative practices, I was in an incredibly dark spot in life. Um, and looking back at it now, one of the things that made it extremely hard to get out of that darkness was the fact that I felt overwhelmingly supported in that darkness. More often than not, people would say, absolutely, it's totally natural to be this angry. It's part of the steps of grief and that that whole deal. But I kept seeing in my world that my darkness was spilling out. It was impacting those around me. My dad specifically called me out several times about how I was becoming someone that he knew I didn't want to be. I was still so angry through all of that I just kind of brushed off that advice. And it wasn't until my young son at that time shared his feelings about our situation that transformation really started in me. We were driving in the car, and he, from the back seat, asked me what had happened. What happened to Uncle Mike? And how do you tell a 3-year-old that somebody who they see as their best friend is no longer alive? That their part in your story has ended. So I responded back that there was a man who made a really bad choice, and that really bad choice killed Uncle Mike. And he was quiet, and I was not prepared for our conversation to continue. But from there, he asked me why. And how do you explain that to a small child? Why? Why is there such darkness in the world? Why do people make decisions that so negatively impact other people? And that sometimes people make really bad decisions. And he got very quiet. And then he answered back that maybe a lion should eat him. And at first I thought it was kind of funny, until I really started thinking about why my very small child was looking at another human being with such anger and aggression, and it was me. I was setting the example for how we cope in these situations, and that broke my heart. So I did start getting involved more with restorative justice. My dad went and did his victim offender dialogue. He went to extend forgiveness to the man who killed my brother for our family. When I was speaking that fateful night on that panel, that man came up and introduced himself as the man who killed my brother. I was a completely changed person. I started to look at that as honestly a turning point, because I had never thought through all of this that there were people that loved the man who killed my brother, that cared for him, that knew him on a deep emotional level. And I had reduced him in my mind to a newspaper clipping, and started to reflect more on what that would look like in my life if I were a newspaper clipping, if I was being defined by the worst decisions that I have ever made. And that was the point when I decided that I needed to participate in my own victim offender dialogue. I needed to go and not only extend my personal forgiveness to the man who killed my brother, but also to apologize for the things that I had done, the steps that I had taken to give him all he had coming. Because that's not my job. That's not my place. So I started to put into action the steps to do this victim offender dialogue, this restorative conference. And I had the joy and the pleasure to work with Jonathan and his fantastic team. It was an extremely long process, primarily because I kept avoiding him and his team. I had very underdeveloped coping skills for this situation, and my favorite go-to coping skill was to just not answer emails. So he and his team were very patient, they were very supportive, and they never pushed me faster than I was comfortable going. And the day finally came that I got to sit down across the table from the man who killed my brother. And I was terrified that as a human being, I was going to lose all emotional control. And even though we had scripted and we had practiced and I knew exactly what was going to happen in this meeting, I still was afraid of myself and what I might say. But I can say that honestly, it was one of the most transformative, impactful experiences of my life. I found myself sitting across from him, sharing stories of what it was like growing up with my brother. I came to the stark realization that he and I were mourning the loss of the same amazing young man, except I have so many amazing memories to fall back on, and he had nothing. I brought in pictures to show him of my brother growing up, of our family. And as we sat there sharing life experiences, sharing backgrounds, what brought us to that point in time, I found myself crying. But for the first time in a really long time, I wasn't crying for myself. I was crying for him. The empathy that I gained in that moment, in that brief meeting, was overwhelming. I'm really seeing him as a person and not as the worst decision that he had made. After that, we parted ways, and I went through the steps to drop the no contact order. So then we were able to regularly write back and forth. I continue to do speaking events at a very different level, a very different emotional maturity than I had before. After he was released, we were able to do several speaking events together, which was very impactful. Every time we spoke together, I know that there was healing and growth in the audience, and honestly, I probably grew and healed just as much every time we spoke together. Unfortunately, in February, he did reoffend, and now is currently incarcerated. But because Jonathan is fantastic, I am able to hopefully be having contact and starting to heal that up again. When I got the news that he had been reincarcerated, I immediately slipped back into that darkness. But with much better coping skills and much more emotional maturity, I was able to reach out to people who I knew were going to support the kind of mindset and thought that I wanted to have. People who were not going to tell me that it was okay to be angry, people that would turn my lens and help me see things from where he was coming from. And now I am so blessed to say that I have this support system, because without restorative justice, I honestly can't tell you the kind of person that I would be today.
Thank you, Angel, for your willingness to share that very intimate part of your family's history and your life. What both you and Craig remind us of are two components of the restorative justice process that are lacking in our general criminal justice system. One of those, Craig mentioned, was the desire of so many people who've caused harm to seek forgiveness and to ask for forgiveness from the persons that they'd harmed, and the value of that process. And the other component of that you mentioned, Angel, is the value of those who have been harmed to have an opportunity to have a voice in the process. In so much of our criminal justice system, those who have been harmed, those who are the victims, they never have an opportunity to say anything. They often don't have a voice in the process, with so many people plea bargaining with trials that infrequently occur. The people who are harmed never really have an opportunity to share their story of how it impacted their lives and the lives of their family and the ones that they love. So this concept of healing, this concept of bringing people together, seeking restoration, seeking reconciliation from your stories is obviously so important. And it's yours are two stories of many, many stories of people who've been affected by the benefits of restorative justice. So I've got another question for the three of you. You've shared a little bit about this, but I want to ask you, because of your participation in the restorative justice conferences, so how has that affected you emotionally? How has that affected you psychologically? How has that affected you personally? And moreover, how have you begun to incorporate some of the principles that you learned through restorative justice into your life and into your family's lives? Hey, Angel, I'll let you go first.
Thank you. So I am an educator of very young children. I have 4 and 5-year-olds in my class, and a lot of them, this is their first experience in a school building. And with that comes a lot of harm. Honestly, there's a whole lot of disagreement and learning how to function in a social society and learning how to participate in that give and take. So there truly is a whole lot of harm, and it is unintentional. But in my classroom, I have started using restorative practices and teaching them at a very young age. So really, they do understand that even in our everyday altercations, you accidentally bump into someone, well, that might turn into them dropping their pencil box. Now, how are we going to fix this? And understanding where everyone is coming from, who has been affected. Maybe you bumped into them, they dropped their pencil box, and now that startled someone, and now they messed up on their work. It's just a domino effect, and that doesn't need to ruin our days. That we just have to figure out how to fix it, and we move forward. I have my own personal children that range in age from 5 to almost 16. And we do a lot of it at home too. A lot of what were you thinking? What were you feeling? And how is someone going to fix that? Whether it's you fixing it because you have caused the harm, or you have been harmed, and how is it, going to be, most efficient for someone else to fix what happened? In my everyday relationships, just the way I approach things is very different. I feel like I look through a very different lens than a lot of people. And it really comes back to how life has handed me what most would look at as a very frustrating and painful, traumatic experience. But it has truly shaped who I am, and I really do feel like, I can make a positive impact with the tragedy that we've been handed.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that you're bringing it into your classroom. That's really a wonderful um, aspect of how this has affected your life and is now affecting the lives of your students. Craig, I'm going to ask you how your participation in restorative justice has affected you emotionally and psychologically and personally, and how you may have incorporated some of those principles into your life and into the lives of those in your family.
Well, emotionally, it turned me into an old teddy bear. Um, you know, um, like when you live in a vacuum as a child of, an absence of genuine love and affection, um, that can turn you into something that's, it's not good for the world. You know what I mean? And that's where I was. So I really didn't have a lot of emotion. You know, uh, I think we've all heard like the old adage of a parent like hitting the kid and the kid's crying. The kid says, "Oh," or the parent will say, "Well, I'll give you something to cry about while you're beating me, so that's why I'm crying." That's where I came from. So I really didn't have any emotion. I was taught that emotion was a bad thing. And it's very interesting that the way I learned that it's not only okay, but it's preferable to care about people was from the woman that I almost killed. And that act of grace and love that she showed me by forgiving me, that made me psychologically stop and start analyzing things like, oh, wait a second here, what's going on with this? What is this really all about? And how can I get some of what she's got? My perspective is that if you can forgive somebody like that, like that's pure love right there. Like, how can I get a piece of that to have the peace that she had? How can I incorporate that into my life? So, through years and years and years of thinking, of talking, like say Jonathan, different people, I was start to able to attain that. So how has all of this affected me personally as a former offender, a former perpetrator towards another human being? What this has helped me to be able to do is to be a human. It's allowed me to be someone that is loving, that is caring, that is overly sensitive to other people's emotions, overly sensitive to other people's feelings. I try to be a good person. I try to help people. I try to, whether it's at work, instead of when I'm trying to explain something to someone for the 800,000th time, how to do a simple process, instead of getting frustrated and yelling, I stop and think, not in these terms. It's a new thought process I'm going to steal from Angel. Everybody's got their own newspaper clipping. Every one of us listening to this, everyone in the world has their own newspaper clipping. And I don't know that this person is maybe tired and that's why they're not getting it today. Or maybe this person just can't stand this job or me. That's understandable also. Maybe that's not why they're getting it. It's not for me to be a bad person and make someone else's life miserable. And I've tried taking it to the extent And Jonathan will get a kick out of this, I'm sure, that, you know, my girlfriend and I have two amazing cats and they're spoiled rotten. So sometimes when I want to go to sleep, because I have to get up and go to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, our fattest, laziest cat will be in my spot on the bed. And I refuse to move him. And I refuse to move him because, as crazy as it may sound, that cat has a right to that spot. If that cat's happy in that spot, I'm not going to try to ruin that cat's happiness. And that's, in a nutshell, what restorative justice gave me. There was a lot of work put into it. There still is a lot of work put into it, but in the worldly terms, I'm a supervisor at my job. I went from a person that was considered a horrible human being in the media for what I did to now I'm entrusted with a multi-million-dollar company. I have the keys to the place. I can do what I want for ill or for good. I'm on 3 different community boards, 2 different community committee within the community. I try making the world a better place wherever I can, and that's directly attributable, however you say that word, to the lady for giving me all those years ago and saying, "Hey, you're not that action." That's what restorative justice is. It's. I mean, listen to it. It's restorative justice. And I'm here to tell you my side of the so-called justice system, my side of going through prison. It's neither restorative and it's certainly not justice. So.
Well, thank you, Craig. As an old preacher, you stand before all of us. I can speak from the world of preaching as someone that not only gives us hope, but is an example of God's redemptive power. And so I give thanks for that and for your life and for your willingness to share your life story with us. So thank you. Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you. You have immersed your professional life in this area of restorative justice and restorative practices. So if you could tell us, step a little bit outside of your lawyer suit and tell us how your participation in restorative justice conferences and other areas of restorative justice has affected you emotionally and psychologically and personally.
I think the first thing is a sense of it actually unifies those parts. Like there is no distinction to me, right? I've had students when we're going to like a prison program or going to Green Bay Correctional, actually a program that Craig was familiar with up at Green Bay. Students would talk to me and they would sort of say like, well, who am I supposed to be there today? Like, am I going as like a law student or am I going as a person? And I'm like, hold on. Like let's stop and just sort of unpack that thing you just sort of said, right? Let's hope that you're always a person, right? Like that, and that's like what you are first, and all these other things. So it was about sort of integrating, these parts of ourselves. And I'll say like you cannot do this work and not be changed, and quite frankly, not be changed for the better. I have frequently told people, Angel, I know has heard this, that sense of I feel in this role of being able to be involved in restorative justice, I get the distinct pleasure of getting to work with people who are vastly better people than me, right? The sense of like looking at their sort of capacity for compassion and for change and for those individuals who are able to get to that space of forgiveness. Again, I would sort of like to say, like, I would hope if I was placed in those situations that I would make those same choices, that I would choose the powers of redemption and choose to believe. But I can't know that, right? No one can know exactly how you're going to respond or react. Like we can hope, right? And we can like believe how we think, but I have enough humility to know that until you are faced with that great adversity, that you do not know how you will respond. And thinking about that and seeing the ways again that so as Craig says. Again, I've had the pleasure of knowing Craig now since 2013, and have had the pleasure of seeing, like, again, him grow and change, and countless other people, right? That sense of start in one space, where again, they're sort of hiding from who they are and what they've done, don't feel pride in themselves, have very little confidence, and feel that they are nothing, right? Or that they are terrible. And through this course of a process, rather than we think about our sense of this punitive system of pushing people down and hurting people, that transformation is a sense of liberation through accountability, right? So that sense of, like, actually we are freed by taking accountability for what we've done, because we don't have to hide from it anymore. We don't have to separate ourselves from it, because it's just one part of you. It's not the whole thing, right? And so the sense of being able to see that time and time and time again, watching people change, like restorative justice isn't something that I do anymore, right? It's just like, it is sort of, it's about living in a restorative way. It impacts the way that, again, that I think about the practice of law, the way that I teach, the way that I parent, the way that I give, as Craig said too, like the same thing, like you see these sort of interactions, and you go about the world, I think, with a different sort of mindset, a broader lens, a collective mindset, acknowledging those sorts of pieces. And again, also that sense of being able to sit with people in profound trauma, to be able to give them peace, to be able to give them something at the end that they might be able to have, like a good night's sleep, or not have the fear that they had before, or the anxiety, or feel that deep pain, or don't have the questions that they've asked thousands and thousands of times in their head since something terrible has happened. Is deeply transformative, again, on a personal level, as well. I always felt, when I was going into schools and sitting in circle in classrooms, as a much younger person, that I felt that they would sort of say, be grateful for this sort of gift of what you're sort of giving them. But I always felt like I was walking away with so much more, and changed almost more than a classroom was, right? Like the learning and the understanding of human experience, the understanding of how do I connect and relate to other people, where are the ways in which I see myself and other people, or I resonate with them. That sense of really understanding humanity and seeing people clearly. I would talk about in a prison program, we had that same prison program, this idea of, for me, it was like a twice yearly sort of eye exam or eye test, where it's like, if I, without my glasses, like people outlines and they're like fuzzy, but like restorative justice, like putting the glasses on and seeing them for who they are, like a clear and crisp shape, not a fuzzy outline of this like amorphous other, but seeing them to their very core, and allowing them the space to do that and to be that. The other thing, when you think about personally, emotionally, part of it is like, whatever you do, whatever sort of, again, whether in ministry or any other sort of healing profession, this idea, it's really hard to help people heal if you haven't dealt with some of your own stuff. Right. And so there's a sense of like, there can be dual processing that is occurring. And the sense of it takes a lot of reflective work. I mean, again, worlds more reflective and introspective than I'm sure that I was 20 plus years ago. And I don't think that's just a result of age. I think it is, again, deeply the result of being able to work with incredible individuals and walk with them and carefully examine their life, what they've experienced, and how grateful they are for that. Because it's a space unlike any other. It's not therapy. Like I'm not a therapist. Like that's not our role. That's not our job. Like we have very specific things that we are trying to accomplish, right? And whether that's searching for information and getting answers to questions and sort of the careful preparation in the back and forth. We also have the benefit, quite frankly, that no therapist really has in these sort of situations, which is like knowing and getting to meet with this other side, right? So it's, it is a sense of being able to offer this like detached third party perspective on this other person and who they are and their actions, and being able to give insights and information there. All the while that changes the way you sort of see the world with greater capacity, I think, for love, and a greater capacity for compassion, and quite honestly, a greater capacity for justice, recognizing that that looks differently for different people.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for all the good work that you're doing. We really appreciate you being here with us this evening. I would be remiss if I didn't give my good friend Nora Jacob an opportunity to answer this question. So Nora, I'm going to ask you as well, how has your involvement with restorative justice affected you emotionally and psychologically and personally?
It's given me really a new lease on life, a different and much more healthy way of looking at the world after going through, I'm a little older than the other folks here, of going through periods of the United States history that filled with civil rights struggles and various human rights struggles. So the systemic stuff, and also being someone who was significantly harmed as a child and then had repressed memory syndrome, and work through all of that as a young person and growing older person. I felt when I was first introduced to restorative justice, I felt as though my whole world shifted. It's hard to explain to people who are happy or comfortable in the current system of criminal justice and punitiveness, but a whole lot of things came together. One of them is this, the power of empathy. And we've kind of alluded to it in this conversation, but when I go in and I facilitate a group, so what we do is more focus on social and emotional skills, as well as the accountability, the claiming responsibility for the harm, and working toward more self-understanding and self-forgiveness, and then coming to terms with what forgiveness might come and what might not come. Really depends. One of the things we do, our culminating experience, is to bring in people who have been harmed in the general ways that their counterpart in the panel, the counterparts, have done harm. So people who have carried out sexual violence, and 3 people who have been harmed by sexual violence. The people who come in are not raw off the street. They're people who have gone through the same preparation process that my colleagues from Wisconsin have talked about. And when it happens, there's always a moment when there's this recognition of humanity, shared humanity and personhood. I remember we were sitting in a circle with a woman who had lost her adult son to car collision and a drunk driver. And the person that was incarcerated had done some of those things and not other pieces of it, but basically it was the loss of a life through violent harm. And this woman had brought along into the prison room where we were doing this, her son's wallet and a picture of her son and his belt. And she just brought them because they gave her comfort, right? And so the wallet was being passed around, and the man sitting next to me, the incarcerated man sitting next to me, looked at it and went pale, and he said, I had a wallet just like this when I was in high school. And that one thing, it sounds crazy in some ways. And yet that connection was the emotional connection that helped him start to find meaning in what she said, which was, I forgive you. And at first he could not accept that, just could not accept it. And yet by the time they finished their dialogue, like 15 minutes, they had begun on a path that would heal them both. It's remarkably powerful. And I always think going into a prison, it's like going into another empire, right? It's different laws, a different like the emperor rules, the warden rules, and it's just a whole different system. But going in and finding people willing to open themselves to being people who did harm, people who were harmed, rather than by the titles and the worst thing or the worst thing we've ever done, is so powerful. It's so powerful to speak about one another as people in a system that lifts up justice in a context where that justice is punitive and tries to take away our humanity. So it's been, so I'm thinking as I see you folks, I assume all three of you have met one another. And at the same time, like, where else do you find empathy in the world? Where do you offer empathy in the world that you wouldn't have before? Because for me, that's all the difference. I walk around, I work with at Promise Youth and in an urban environment. And you would think, looking at my body, you know, what my body looks like, that's not a fit. But I just beam love, because I've learned that everybody's a person and worthy of respect and dignity. So I'm curious about your empathy journeys.
Thank you, Nora. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists who participated this evening, Craig and Angel, Jonathan and Nora. If those who are viewing weren't convinced that restorative justice is a transformative, life-changing movement, then you weren't listening carefully enough. You have our email addresses that are in the chat. So if you have questions or would like some more information, you can email us. You can go to nbacares.org, our website, and contact us through that website. I'm going to turn it back over to Reverend Hernandez now. Thank you all.
Well, Dean, before we conclude, we got a question from Neil Greeley, I think is the way you pronounce the last name. And even if we cannot answer deep, but maybe we can begin the discussion and then share some of the resources. He is asking, or Neil is asking, are there any books from which one can learn more about the process? It sounds as if it takes years of preparation to be effective. So the question is open, and I think my commitment is that we will answer, and then we can also share a list of resources and put that together with this with the recording of this webinar.
Well, if you leave your email address, Neil, I will send you some resources, and the others may as well. I'm sure Jonathan has some resources that he can direct you to. There's a series of books that was produced by folks from the East Mennonite University called The Little Books of Justice and Peace Building, which is, they're short reads, but they're very effective in introducing people to a variety of different restorative justice practices.
I would say, like, the book that I read that I think resonated most with this work that that we're doing sort of in this sort of the space of violence was Daniel Sered's Until We Reckon, right, which is about reckoning with the violence in our society, right? We're not basically going to get to where we need to be until we reckon with that violence. And yeah, there's a host of other books from a victim offender mediation handbook. There's a lot of authors and a substantial amount of material in this space and in this world that a lot, again, sort of some Google searches can find, but also I'm happy to provide more additional things. I would say, if I could respond a little bit to, Nora, what you said about the sense of thinking about sort of the movements, right, that you've sort of lived through. Something that really like popped right into my head is that sense when we think about restorative justice, and what resonates around that is a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King about justice at its best being love, correcting that which stands against love, right? And so the sense of utilizing this thought of human connection and coming together really resonates. So I appreciate you noting that.
So Neil shared the email, and I have shared that with the group. I also share with Neil some resources that Nora shared. But again, I think that it won't hurt if all of you gather some suggestions, and we will include that in the description of the recording. I am more than grateful. We are more than grateful to all of you, or your lives, all your ministries, everything that all of you are doing, and we're grateful for your time. Of course, time always betrayed us, and this will, conclude our time today here. Today webinar, and this is for all the participants, will be available very soon on our webpage. And we ask you that if you connect with the material, if you want to revisit the webinar, that you can also share that with other people, maybe with your congregation. The MBA will be doing next year on the General Assembly. We're going to be doing a workshop about restorative justice. So there are going to be other opportunities for the members of our denomination to keep connecting with this amazing and transformative reality. And for more information about the prison and jail ministries, as well as all the other ministries and excellent work that the National Benevolent Association has done, is doing, and will be doing, please, we invite you to visit us as mbacare.org. Once again, thank you, all of you, and thank you to all the participants to be willing to connect and be fully present in this webinar. Blessings to all of you, and have a beautiful rest of your night.
Thank you, Craig, Jonathan, Angel. Thank you, Dean and Hector. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.